morning, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Christine Jacobs. I'm the Executive Director of Represent PA. We are a PAC that raises money for women running for state legislature in Pennsylvania, and progressive Democratic women running in Pennsylvania. We're really pleased today. I love this photo, by the way, Bridget. It's, I get all these stock photos from people. I love the joy in your face in this one. It's just wonderful.
Thank you.
Bridget Todd is the communications director for UltraViolet. I've known about UltraViolet for a few years, as they are, they started as an organization similar to MoveOn.org to get activists moving on important issues. Their focus is women, and their focus is how women are affected by politics and how women are affected by our society, and what we can do to activate people to hear their voice and to move what is going on in society. So we're really excited to have Bridget here today to talk with us. I want to start by talking about what's going on in the PA legislature. And it's an awful group of people, my bias, of course, but that's part of being Represent. We have 140 bills have passed through the legislature in 2020. 140 made it to Wolf to sign. Most of those were small corrections, naming of things, issues. Only 27 addressed the pandemic issues, the big issue that's affecting our Commonwealth. Most of the bills that came through addressed Wolf's emergency responses and curbing election responses. And if you remember, after the November election and continuing to today, our legislature, our Republican-led legislature, both in the House and in the Senate, are both pushing hard to limit people's voting rights. They had passed a very good bill, moderately good bill at the end of 2019, which extended mail-in ballots and made it easier for people to vote. And then they realized what they did, and they spent most of 2020 trying to curb those laws. We had a strong Secretary of State. We had a strong Attorney General battling those things. They won every court case that was pressed, but it's been very difficult. And that's what they continue to do. They've also been playing around with some of the money that they got from the federal budget. And there was $108 million in aid to renters and homeowners that they just didn't get around to dealing with. And instead, they allocated federal money to fix Department of Corrections budget. This was supposedly not allowed by the federal aid, was not supposed to fix budgets, but of course they moved around what they called it, and that's exactly what it got used for. Wolf vetoed in 2020 a record 19 bills. It was 15 more than he did in 2019. For years, I've thought of him as Governor Veto, but 19 bills. Many of them had to do with curbing his emergency responses to the pandemic. And they also had to do with changing the voting laws, a record 19 bills. We're lucky we had a Democratic governor to be able to have the veto pen. Part of our theme with all of you over the months has been that the Democrats rarely get to present rules. For example, this was in 2019 was the first time that the words climate change have been allowed to be talked about in the Environment and Energy Committee. They've mostly talked about fracking and drilling. And that's because just like the US Senate, the Pennsylvania legislature is completely controlled by the majority. We refer to it as the tyranny of the majority, in that nothing that the Democrats want to get done, none of the things that we all think are important issues for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania get to be discussed. So they're all Republican initiatives. So this is not an election year. I was talking with Lois Herb right before this about an upcoming Senate race in Pennsylvania, special election. There will be more specials, but most of what we're trying to do in 2021 is set the stage for better elections in 2022. Make sure that people know what's going on in the state, make sure that they understand what the issues are, make sure that they understand how poor our government is run because of budgeting and control by the state legislature. I urge you to take a look at Governor Wolf's 22 budget that has just been, that he has initiated. It's a statement of values. It's a statement of what we need to do for education. He's raising taxes on the wealthiest. The net result would be raising taxes on the wealthiest Pennsylvanians in order to fund our education, which is so across the Commonwealth, which is so poorly funded and unequally funded today. But no change is going to come in Pennsylvania without activism. No change is going to come by just showing up every 2 years and voting and saying, oops, that didn't work. And what does activism mean? And that's the theme of today's discussion. Money, time, energy, and strong voices are needed. We've been talking about a number of issues that represent, and I assure you we're going to continue talking about issues that just to make sure that everybody's aware of what's going on in Pennsylvania. But we need to learn all how to raise our voices. UltraViolet, who we're going to hear from in a minute, seeks to amplify women's voices, as I said, in the tradition of MoveOn.org. And we'll talk about more of what we expect from people who are giving to represent and listening to our calls in a minute. But right now I bring you Bridget, who's going to talk about, Bridget Todd, who's going to talk about what's going on, what UltraViolet is, and new discussions that they're having about disinformation campaigns. So Bridget, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Good morning, y'all. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Bridget Todd. I am the communications director with UltraViolet, where we pretty much want to amplify the voices of women. We want to build social and political power for women so that our issues are front and center and that great folks like you can help fight for change alongside with us. So thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for all of your great work across Pennsylvania. So I wanted to sort of run through what we'll be talking about today. I would like to kind of set the stage of where we are as it pertains to disinformation, talk a bit about what UltraViolet has done in the election and what we're going to continue to be doing going forward, and talk a bit about what all of you on this call can do today to fight back against disinformation. First of all, a little bit of definitions, I guess we'll start with. Disinformation and misinformation are different things. And usually when I do these kinds of trainings or webinars, people always ask, what is the difference between disinformation and misinformation? Well, misinformation is misleading or inaccurate content that you might see on television or on the news or on social media, but that the person who is putting it out might not know that that content is misleading, right? They might think it's true themselves. They might, just be putting it out there just in case it's true. They might not know that what they're saying is inaccurate, and so they are not trying to intentionally mislead you. Disinformation, however, is very different in that the person who is putting it out there, they are intentionally trying to cause confusion. They are intentionally trying to lie to you. A good way to think about it, or a good rule of thumb, is misinformation is misleading information. Disinformation is a damn lie, right? This is someone who is trying to mislead you because they're not a nice person and they're trying to cause chaos. So UltraViolet, as soon as we got wind that Joe Biden was talking about picking a woman, possibly a Black woman or a woman of color for his running mate, we knew early on that this was going to be a problem. It's very clear to us that women and women of color, especially Black women, are disproportionately targeted for the spread of false news, online harassment, mis and disinformation. And so we already knew this. We have the data is very clear about this. So we didn't want to wait until someone like Senator Harris or Vice President Harris was chosen. We wanted to make sure that we were inoculating our audience ahead of time to prepare for this reality. So it's not just about Kamala Harris. It's really about women everywhere. We know what we saw history-making, record-breaking women running for office this year, which was amazing. And so we wanted to make sure that we were creating the conditions to have a political and social climate where women and underrepresented people of all stripes could really get political power and run for office without having their records be talked about in a way that is not fair, right? So all of these candidates deserve a political and social climate where they can run on their merits and their records and their words, not racist, sexist disinformation, not false stories, not distortions. A recent study called She Persisted by Lucina Dimecco showed the ways that social media really does present a disinformation threat for women who run for office. An artificial intelligence analysis of the 2020 primaries showed that female candidates are attacked more often than male candidates by fake news accounts, and female politicians in the Ukraine, Italy, and India suggests this phenomenon is not just happening in the US, it's a global one. And as you might have seen, if you spend any time on social media at all, social media really does offer a fertile ground for what we call gender disinformation, right? So this is disinformation that really does traffic in biases about women being emotional or unintelligent or not capable, right? All of these untrue, unfair, sexist biases based on gender, that's what we call gender disinformation. And we've seen a lot of this in different ways, right? Like, it's not just saying like, oh, a woman is not capable or she got where she is by using her sexuality. It's really putting that idea repeatedly and consistently into the media, onto social media without it being checked, so such that it becomes something that these women who are running for office are expected to respond to, or it becomes attached to who they are and how they run for office. So this is actually an early example that we saw. So we knew some of the false and distorted narratives about Harris that were out there. This is actually an image that was posted to Facebook several times. Some of our activists actually had to manually flag this image for Facebook to get them to take it down. But as you can see, this image really does flatten and distort who Harris is and makes it about her gender, right? So it's not something that is a response to her words or her record or her history as a public official. It completely distorts and lies about who she is because she is a woman. So it's very clear that disinformation is even worse for women of color candidates. A new report from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue revealed that women of color candidates are targeted by the right on social media at very alarming rates. And so here's just a little bit of information that they found. Abusive messages accounted for more than 15% of those directed at every female lawmaker, compared to about 5 to 10% when you look at male candidates. Women of color are particularly likely to be targeted. Ilhan Omar received the highest proportion, about 39%, of abusive messages of all the candidates on their study. And AOC received the highest amount of abusive comments on Facebook. And so when you look at this data, it's not, you might be thinking like, oh, well, how does it play along gender lines, along race lines? It's important to note that other black lawmakers who are men, like Tim Scott or Cory Booker, they received similar levels of abuse to white male candidates. However, attacks against them were more likely to be about race. Abuse directed toward women was more likely to be about gender than targeting men. Abuse targeting men was more generalized and focused on their political stances, their actual record, things they actually said, while messages directed at women are more likely to focus on appearance or general competence. Again, if you've spent any time at all on Facebook or Twitter, you have likely seen this. This data probably is not telling you anything that you did not already know. Images, memes, jokes about women, it's always about their appearance or some sort of unfair sexist swipe, as opposed to being about their actual record as lawmakers. Female Democrats received 10 times more abusive comments than their male counterparts on Facebook, and Republican women received twice as many abusive messages as Republican men. So it definitely is something that folks who do this kind of thing on social media, they are not equal opportunity offenders. It is definitely worse for women and women of color. So let's talk a little bit about why people do this. This is something that keeps me up at night. Why is it that we have folks, that bad actors who are so hell-bent on distorting women and distorting other underrepresented voices when they try to hold public office? And so one thing to know about disinformation is that it really does limit and suppress speech. And so even if you're not someone who is interested in running for office, you're just someone who is an activist or someone who has something to say about politics, wants to use your voice and get involved, well, online harassment and disinformation is meant to make you feel fearful or make you think twice about doing that. And it's actually very effective. It also dissuades people from underrepresented or marginalized backgrounds from running for office, right? So if you see the way that people like AOC or Harris or Ilhan Omar are treated when they run for office, you might think twice about doing it. You might think, well, I don't want this kind of heat on me. I don't want to face these kinds of unfair, sexist and racist attacks on my character. I would like to be able to run on who I am and my words and my records. And so it really is an effective means of getting people to not be more involved in politics, activism in general. And it's very, very effective so many of the women and other people that I talk to always cite not wanting to be harassed, not wanting to have to deal with these kinds of sexist, racist attacks as a reason why they don't speak up more. So it really is something that can keep people who otherwise would be amazing activists, people that we definitely need in our movement to have our movement be more inclusive and more effective. Because of disinformation, folks like that are just staying out of it. So it's really a problem. And then lastly, one of the big reasons why people do this kind of thing is because it really invites underrepresented people to just check out of their democracy entirely. And we really saw this a lot in the 2016 election when bad actors were targeting Black voters, not just to get them to vote for Trump, but to also get them to stay home on election day. So just to say, you know, the two parties are the same, Democrats, Republicans, and neither of them is really looking out for me. I'm not going to vote. It's not important to me, right? Like that is for every person who just checks out and says both parties are the same, I'm not going to vote. That is a win for bad actors and disinformers because that is what they want. They want folks to not recognize their power, to be so confused by what's happening online and all of the spin that they just don't even care about politics anymore. And we know how serious that is. We need everybody in this movement. And so if people look at the two parties and think they're the same, if people don't feel like there's a party out there that really has their best interests at heart, we know it's certainly not the other side. You know, that is a win for bad actors and disinformers. So we deserve to have a social and political landscape where women of color, talented women of color like Harris are able to run on their histories, their words, their legacies, right? We don't have to love every candidate that comes out, but each candidate deserves a level playing field where they're judged on their merits. And disinformation keeps us from having that. And so we really want to build a world where the next generation of women sees people like Kamala Harris and they get excited. They say, I want to run for office. I want to be an activist. I want to join this movement. I want to join this fight. And I know that I can. And so really what we want to do is create the conditions to build that world so that the next generation of underrepresented and marginalized political leaders, public officials, activists, all of that can say, if I run for office, I know that my voice will be taken seriously and I will be given the chance to run on my merits. And so that's really what UltraViolet wants to create. So how do we do this? First of all, the media, right? And so we often think about disinformation as being spread by individual social media users, and that's definitely the case. But they aren't the only bad actors out there. Sometimes the media doesn't quite realize the role that they have in shaping the public perception about women, men, and people of color. And therefore, it's really important to make sure that reporting avoids any form of gender stereotypes or race-based stereotypes that limit and trivialize women and men, as well as present really distorted and accurate views of the world and its possibilities, right? So like I said earlier, we really want to build a world that it's full of possibility for the next generation of leaders where their understanding of what is possible for them if they decide to be a public official or an activist is not so limited. And so we want to make sure that we're not allowing the media to just reinforce stereotypes that create a very limited, a very distorted, a very false understanding of what's possible when folks really use their voice and speak up. So let's talk a little bit about how this works. And so media coverage of candidates can really perpetuate bias, and that kind of bias creates the conditions for disinformation to breed and grow and fester, particularly on social media platforms. And it can be like a vicious cycle. You know, media coverage of candidates perpetuates unfair biases. That bias then fuels disinformation campaigns and online harassment of those candidates, because the more that you hear that, you know, this woman candidate is not qualified or this person of color is not qualified, the more disinformation will spread about them. And then the media will then cover that issue in a way that simply perpetuates that bias. And so we really want to say, hey, let's break that cycle so that we're not just in this perpetual motion machine of bias and unfair stereotypes. We want to make sure that we have systems to hold the media accountable so that they're not doing this, so that everybody can have an equal playing field when it comes to running for office. So disinformation campaigns often target marginalized people. And the reason for that, I think, is pretty obvious. Women, people of color, LGBTQ people, immigrants, Muslims, disabled people, et cetera, often are undermined by their success. And bad actors truly know that like they can use and weaponize people's identities to sow hate, right? And so unfortunately, we live in a society where if someone is underrepresented or marginalized, and if they have an intersecting identity, like if they're disabled and also a woman, or if they're LGBTQ and also an immigrant, bad actors know that we already are kind of biased against these people. And so they know that they can weaponize these attacks and that it's going to work. Disinformation campaigns really do draw on negative stereotypes about marginalized people to lend a sense of credibility while attacking their intended target. So if you look at things like QAnon or Pizzagate, that conspiracy relied on this false narrative of Hillary Clinton as unlikable or untrustworthy, insults that are frequently lobbed at women running for office. Or look at the birther conspiracy when it came to President Obama. That was fueled by this racist and Islamophobic idea that Obama was not like us because he's a person of color, right? And so bad actors know they can seize on these narratives that are already present in our society, unfortunately, to further undermine candidates from underrepresented backgrounds. And so we want to make sure that that's not something that the media is making easier, that the media is not normalizing that kind of behavior, that they're calling it out, and that we can hold them accountable when they don't. So one of the ways that we did this is that we created a reporting guide in order to help level the playing field for women and people of color who run for office. This guide, I'll add the link to it in the chat in just a moment. This guide is really meant for media makers, but also anybody who is interested in learning more about the ways that the media can undermine women and folks of color in politics. So one of the ways that we did this is by just calling out some of the racist and sexist tropes that the media should be debunking, not fueling, and not just printing as if it is fact. So things like associating a female candidate with a man as a means of legitimizing her, or when a woman runs for office, too much focus on who's taking care of her kids or her private life or her family life, or analyzing or focusing on her clothing, things like this. Things that we know are out there in society because our society is not always fair to women, but that can really be seized on by bad actors to not just insult them, but to further delegitimize them trying to run for office or create social or political power for themselves. So I wanted to give you a couple of quick examples. One is, when you're looking at Facebook or Twitter, when you see an article posted and you see the headline and the image and maybe a little bit of subtext, well, oftentimes, unfortunately, in our fast media landscape, people are not always clicking into the actual story to read what it's about, right? They're just getting their information from the headline and the image. And so that puts a lot of weight on the headline. The headline has to really tell the full story. In these examples, these headlines really do traffic in the kind of lies and distortions rather than just sort of reporting them fairly. So in this image on the left here, the picture of Chrissy Teigen, the headline reads, "Trump haters are pedophiles. Inside QAnon, the conspiracy theory aiming to put Hollywood behind bars," right? So we know that Chrissy Teigen is not a pedophile. We know that is a complete fabrication, but the way that this article has been printed, you would think that is legitimate. You wouldn't necessarily know if you were scrolling this quickly that they're in fact reporting on a completely baseless conspiracy theory that has no grounding in fact whatsoever. Because of the irresponsible way this headline is framed, you might see this very quickly and think, oh, I guess Chrissy Teigen is a pedophile, even though it's not true. And so especially when you think about things that are sensitive in nature, it's that much more important that people talk about them, particularly people in the media, talk about them and frame them responsibly and ethically, because bad actors and disinformers, they really do seize on topics that are sensitive or inflammatory to disinform. And so when we're talking about something as serious as pedophilia and someone being accused of it, it's very important that the media doesn't just legitimize completely baseless claims and normalize that kind of thing. Here's another good example that might be a little harder to spot. So one of the ways that we often delegitimize women is by associating them with a powerful man. So, Harris cannot stand on just her own. She has to be associated with someone like Obama to be, considered powerful or important or worth our time. And so just as a good reminder that sometimes when we're talking about disinformation that is rooted in bias, it can actually be kind of subtle, right? And it's like, you really have to think about like, oh, well, when they're talking about Harris's record, why do they call her the female Obama? What's going on there? So definitely kind of train yourself to really think about these headlines. And that's really what we want to be doing, is sort of creating the conditions to debunk and critique when the media sort of just perpetuates bias rather than calling it out. Again, here is an image of Kirsten Gillibrand. This one is offensive to me for lots of reasons. One, it's this sort of over-the-top focus on her physical appearance, right? You don't really see a lot of male candidates being scrutinized for their physical appearance or their weight in this way. And then further, it really does drive home this idea that, you know, a woman, like, you know, when a woman runs for office, you should be wondering where her kids are or her husband or things like that. We know those things are rooted in sexism. We know that male candidates do not often get treated to that same kind of scrutiny. So really sort of training yourself to see the ways that the media can fuel these kinds of biases and holding them accountable when they do. So I want to talk a little bit about this because I think there's a lot of women on the call today. And I think that the way that we talk about ambitious women who run for office, we really need to be critiquing the way that we frame that. I think Harris gave us a great example. So any candidate who is seeking the second highest office in the land is showing ambition, right? So Harris is an ambitious person, just like anybody who will be running for vice president or president is ambitious. That is not a dirty word. That is not a bad thing. However, some in the media would not have you believe this. And a really good example of the kind of double standard that punishes women candidates and women activists for running for office or trying to speak up or trying to hold a public platform is the way that we dealt with Harris in the media. So when Romney chose Paul Ryan as his running mate, the press called Ryan, quote, a young, ambitious Beltway insider for the camera-ready presence. When Harris Harris, who also was at the time, being talked about as a vice presidential candidate, she was described as too ambitious to be vice president. And so, as we know, it is completely okay for women, particularly women in public office, to have ambition and want to strive to have a voice and power in politics. And we need to make sure that our media is not framing that as something that is bad. They're not framing it in a different light. So I want to talk about Facebook for a moment because we spent a lot of our time this past election cycle and currently really trying to hold Facebook accountable for the way that they've allowed disinformation and misinformation and conspiracy theories to really fester on their platforms. And so one of the reasons why we focus so much on Facebook is because by nature of the way that Facebook works, it is an algorithmic platform, which means that if you post something on Facebook and it's getting lots of comments, lots of likes, people are really seeing it, it's got lots of eyeballs in it, that's always going to be the content that Facebook shows you more of, right? And so because of the way that that works, Facebook's own algorithms are biased toward inflammatory content. And so if you put something on Facebook that says, my neighbor is, and then you have all kinds of wild accusations, then Facebook is going to make sure that more people see that because people are engaging with it, people are commenting on it, even to dispute it. And so that's one reason why we really focus on Facebook. Another is that Facebook is a partially closed platform. And what that means is that even though it's like a platform that has public groups and public posts, there are also private groups and private posts. And so if you look at something like Twitter, where most of the things that are happening in public, anybody with a Twitter profile can see what's happening, Facebook has an entire ecosystem of closed off private groups where it's much more difficult to analyze what's being said and what's going on. This was especially problematic when you look at things like the insurrection, where the majority of, when you look at where a lot of that planning and a lot of that conversation from the folks that did storm the Capitol on January 6th happened, overwhelmingly it happened on Facebook because it is a private platform. So you had all of these private groups like Stop the Steal, March for Trump, all of these groups that were coordinating and organizing on Facebook, but were able to do so privately because of the nature of it being a private platform that has this ecosystem of private groups. And so that's one of the reasons why folks like us at UltraViolet are so interested in making sure that we can hold Facebook accountable, because the opportunity for chaos and really violence to spread on platforms like that is really big. And so that's one of the reasons why you probably heard so much about Facebook in the aftermath of the attacks on the Capitol last month. So one of the ways that we did this is by targeting Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, directly. UltraViolet members, we filmed a video where we were holding Sheryl Sandberg accountable for allowing violence and disinformation to really fester on Facebook. Sheryl Sandberg really is someone who kind of brands herself as a champion for women. She wrote a book called Lean In, all about how women can sort of take charge of their professional and social and political lives. but we really want her to lean in and do something about disinformation on her platform, because as we know, disinformation overwhelmingly impacts women and women of color. And so you can't really call yourself a champion for women if you are running a platform that allows these violent attacks that hurt women overwhelmingly on your platform. And so this was a very successful campaign that we ran, asking Facebook to shut down groups like Stop the Steal and groups that called for violence and political violence, especially. And you know what's really, I was happy when Facebook banned Trump on January 8th. To be clear, that was only, I think, because of years of pressure from activists and advocates who had been saying that, you know, failing to act was going to allow the kind of violence that we saw on the 6th. But even right now, Facebook is currently, you know, weighing whether or not they made the right choice, and even talking about maybe reinstating Trump. And so right now, Facebook's oversight board is mulling over whether or not they made the right choice. And so it is a constant battle to hold these platforms accountable and to make sure that we're able to have platforms that do not allow for conspiracy theories and disinformation to spread, because it really has such a big impact on our democracy. So I want to talk about some of the ways that UltraViolet did this. First is just general, what you call inoculation. And so inoculation is one of the most effective ways to counter disinformation. You know, making sure that people understand what they're seeing, making sure that they're primed for the kind of disinformation they might see. And so in the aftermath, or in the lead up to the election, we really put out a lot of different memes and images to really train our audience to understand the kind of racist, sexist disinformation they were going to see, and to give them the tools they need to counter it. One of the ways that disinformation actually spreads the most on social media platforms is by people amplifying it or reposting it. So even if you see something that you know is not true, if you, let's say that you see a tweet that has a lie in it or inaccurate information in it, if you retweet that, even to debunk it, even to call it out, because of the way that algorithms work, you're only helping that piece of inaccurate information grow. And so 9 times out of 10, when people are engaging with inaccurate or false information on social media, they're doing so to say, hey, that's not true, but they're inadvertently helping it grow. And so we wanted to make sure our audience understood that the number one way that you can curb disinformation on social media platforms is to not repost it and not engage with it and not amplify it. And then also, we wanted to make sure that we were creating a positive and consistent and supportive social and political climate for women of color. If you were on social media at all last week, you probably saw AOC. Unfortunately, she was at the center of a disinformation campaign because she spoke out against her experiences in the Capitol on January 6th, right? So she told her story. It was quite harrowing if anybody saw it. She described, you know, being so afraid and like someone banging on her door and her hiding in her office, not knowing if this was an insurrectionist who was there to do harm to her. It turned out that this was actually a Capitol police officer who was there to help her, but you know, she didn't know this. And so she went on Instagram Live to just describe how she felt. And almost immediately, she was the victim of a coordinated right-wing disinformation campaign meant to discredit her and smear her. People called her a liar. They said that she was lying about being at the Capitol at all. And some people said that she was just being sort of dramatic or sort of overdoing it. And so we know that the conditions are out there so that women who speak up and tell their stories will not be believed and will not be heard. And so we wanted to make sure that we were inoculating our audience to understand what they were seeing, and that we were just generally presenting a positive and consistent, supportive climate for her, so that other people see, you know, these attacks on women of color will not be tolerated. We are going to make sure that other women who see this know that there will be places and channels that support them loudly and publicly. And that work continues. You know, this was just last week. And so, as we know, the attacks on Obama did not stop. The attacks on Obama's heritage did not stop when he was in office. If anything, they got worse. And so we know this is going to be an uphill fight. We are just getting started, and we're so excited to dig in and make sure that we can continue to create the conditions so that underrepresented folks know that they will be able to run for office and try to get political and social power on their own merits, not on sexist, racist attacks that undermine who they are. So let's talk about things that you can do. I've talked a little bit about it so far, but I want to make sure that it's very clear. the number one way that we can all individually, everybody on this call, can do to curb disinformation and conspiracy theories and sexist, racist attacks is to not amplify it and not help it spread. So even if you see something that you're like, well, that's not true, I want to call it out, 9 times out of 10, you are actually just helping it spread. And so if you're on Facebook and you see someone post something about a candidate that is not accurate or about the vaccine or COVID that is not accurate, it really take a minute and pause before you respond, because again, because of these algorithms, if you comment even to call it out, sometimes you're just helping it grow and helping it get more strong and helping more people see it in their feeds. And so 9 times out of 10, I would say, don't focus on trying to like go in and correct the record, because if it's on Facebook or on Twitter, you might actually just be helping it grow. In your personal conversations online, a good technique is what we call truth sandwich. And so if you've said, I do really want to respond to this person, consider reaching out to them privately if it's someone that you know. And so rather than putting it on Facebook in public, try sending them a personal private message. And when you do so, you can use truth sandwich. And so truth sandwich is when you correct what they've said that is incorrect, give them some data or an accurate source, and then correct what they said again. And so you might say like, the COVID vaccine does not cause autism. Here is a source from the CDC. Again, the COVID vaccine does not cause autism, right? So make a little sandwich of the truth. And studies show that if people hear accurate information more often, that really can help them get out of this mindset that is being driven by false information. Oh, I'm seeing a question here. Let me just, yeah. So again, I would say the majority of the time, like if you're just scrolling Facebook and you see inaccurate information, or Twitter and you see inaccurate information, I would say 9 times out of 10, the best strategy is just to not amplify it, right? But there are some cases where you might be saying like, well, I really do want to call this person in. For instance, if this is like a loved one or somebody that's in your community, someone that you have a deeper relationship with, where it's not just some troll that you don't know on social media. If you're anything like me, which I bet about a lot of you are, you might have friends on social media or like family on social media where they post things and you're thinking, oh, well, that's not correct. And I don't actually know if this person knows that this is correct or not. And so in cases like that, where you do have a relationship with someone, it's not just some rando on social media, where you do feel like you want to talk to them, truth sandwich can be a good way to do that. And we always recommend, if this is someone that you truly do have a relationship with, try reaching out privately as opposed to publicly, so that you're not inadvertently helping that content get more eyeballs on your feed. But it's a little bit of a delicate dance. PEN America Foundation has this great guide to helping people debunk disinformation when it comes to friends and family. I wish I could say that all of my friends and family are really thoughtful people who never post conspiracy theories or incorrect information on social media, but the reality is it happens to the best of us, even myself. And so we do need to have ways of talking about it when it happens in our own communities. But that, like, overwhelmingly, the number one thing that we can all do to make sure that we're creating social media platforms and social media landscapes that allow for accurate information to exist is by thinking of yourself as like an influencer of your little pocket of the internet. So even if you only have 10 followers or 5 followers, you are still an influencer in your little community of the web. And so rather than trying to debunk disinformation or, going on a back and forth, focus instead on sharing positive information about your candidates and your issues, accurate and consistent information. So if folks know that they can come, if folks know that they can come to you and your page to get facts and positive, accurate information about what's going on, then you're going to be feeding them with accurate information. They're going to be less likely to turn to bad actors or inaccurate sources to get disinformation. So really focus on creating your little pocket of the internet that is known for consistent, positive, and accurate, timely information that can really help someone. That is the number one thing that we can all do starting today to help curb disinformation. And if we do this, all of us can create a climate where the next generation of leaders can really have an equal playing field, that we can all run on our merits, we can all be activists and use our voice and be judged on what we say, not our identities, not unfair, sexist, racist attacks. And I think that working together with all of you amazing folks doing such great work across our country, I think that we really can create a landscape that allows the next generation of little ones who look up to folks like Harris to really exist in that world of an equal level playing field. And that's all I have. If you would like to keep up with us, please check out our work at UltraViolet. You can go to weareultraviolet.org. And yeah, I would love to hear what questions folks have.
Sure. Hi. I know when you were talking about how to sort of fight the disinformation, the media, of course, is the primary source aside from maybe our families. And so the question is, we can write letters to the editor, but what's the stronger method for holding the media accountable?
That's a great question. One of the things that we've done at UltraViolet, which I think that anybody can model on their own, is calling folks out on Twitter. So if you see a headline and you're like, oh, that is really sexist garbage, maybe kind of do a little back channeling with folks in your community, folks who you're in community with online, folks at your organization, and say, hey, we're all going to tweet at this. We're going to find this reporter. We're going to tweet at this outlet and say, this is really sexist. Here's why. Like, do not be afraid to, I feel once you start seeing these kinds of biases, once you've trained yourself to see these kinds of biases, do not be afraid to hold media accountable directly. If you can get 4 friends to tweet at the same editor or tweet at the same outlet and say, hey, like, this is really sexist, or this is really racist, or you're repeating a conspiracy theory in a way that legitimizes it, people will listen. I used to run social media for MSNBC, and if you get like even a small handful of folks in the mentions, the person who is running that account will see it. And so that can be an effective way. Sometimes it can be hard because you feel like you're just one voice and it feels like you're screaming into a void. And I definitely know that feeling. But if you can get even just a small handful of people that you're in community with to help amplify what you're saying, it can really be effective. But that's a really great question.
Great, thank you.
Of course.
Somebody asked the question earlier about why go after Sheryl Sandberg and not Mark Zuckerberg?
That's a great question. It's a pretty simple answer. UltraViolet, this was before my time, before I got here, but UltraViolet, once upon a time, supported Sandberg to join Facebook's board. At the time, Facebook had an all-male board, and so we championed her, believing that, as someone who had this public persona as being a supporter of women, we championed her to join Facebook's board. And we were pretty disappointed to see that she was going to not use her position to advocate for these women that she claimed to want to support, and instead was going to turn her back to doing something about the spread of sexist disinformation on her own platform. And so that was why we wanted to go after her, because we had initially supported her, but wanted to make sure that we were then holding her accountable, so that support was not just, supporting a woman who was not going to actually be a champion for other women. Thank
you. One of the things that you brought to mind was the Peggy Noonan article about the vice president, about Kamala Harris when she was running. And Peggy Noonan was a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan, and she writes op-eds for the Wall Street Journal. And she said she just didn't like Kamala Harris because she laughed too much and she didn't seem serious. And there was a big campaign to go after the Wall Street Journal after that, and remind her of and send Peggy Noonan videos of Kamala Harris going after Bill Barr, going after Brett Kavanaugh, going after a number of people, and say, if you don't think this woman is serious, but it was a good campaign to tell Peggy Noonan to be quiet. She apologized. I don't know that she won't do it again, but she did apologize.
Exactly. That's such a great example. And I think she wouldn't have written that article if she did not think that she was going to find a sympathetic audience for that article, right? And so we really need to challenge some of these problematic attitudes in society that allow for climates where that kind of sexist nonsense is going to be tolerated. I love that example.
That's great. Thank you. So we're going to tie this one up right now. I so appreciate Bridget being able to talk with us. Any of your other questions, we will forward on to Bridget to get her written answers. And then when we send out and we let you know that the video is available on our website, we'll also have links to some of the other things she referred to. I particularly want to make sure that that media guide you talked about. Yes, you're not all in the media, but it'd be good to see. It'd be good to know what's going on. She also had a link in her talk about ways to respond, and all of these things are good for you to know. Did I mention we want to train activists? Yes, we want to get you to donate to represent. Yes, this is so important for us, but we want you all to be active. So go follow weareultraviolet.org to find out what their campaigns are. You'd be amazed at the stuff that comes to them. And then it's not so hard. This is COVID. Many of you are sitting here going, how do I be active? What do we do in 2021? Write comments, send emails to people, and learn how to be a better political tweeter or Facebooker. And please, do not retweet things that are bad language. If you listen to Marjorie Taylor Greene this past week, and she said that the best thing for her and her campaign and to raise money was that everybody kept retweeting all of her horrible comments and resending them out. Don't do it. That helped her. Go out and find people who are saying the converse of what she says and send that out. But let's be good consumers of technology. So thank you very much. We'll be going on. I think this was just an amazing discussion. I've loved UltraViolet for a long time. Thank you to our board member, Pat West, who we're having a conversation about UltraViolet, and I know she's a donor to UltraViolet. And thank you to Pat we were having this conversation and we decided it would be a great topic to bring up today. So thank you. So did I mention before Bridget spoke that one of the things we wanted to do was talk about your activism? These are the kind of things that we want to talk about. Let's not waste 2021. We don't have candidates to support in general. Let's think about how do we increase our reach. When this video becomes available, send it to people you know and say, oh my gosh, look what I just learned. Oh, by the way, I should be contributing to Represent PA because they bring me this amazing content, but also because this is important to change the landscape in 2021. So we'll have better 2022 results. We talked, there are some special elections coming up. We want to make sure we have early candidate visibility. We also, one of the things I wanted to bring everybody, make sure you're aware of is, I'm sure many of you have heard me say that Pennsylvania has never had a woman or a person of color as governor or senator. Both positions are open in 2022, and yet the powers that be, and there's a lot of discussion about the two white men who would probably be the leaders in these races. If we don't change Pennsylvania in one of these seats in 2022, it'll be another decade before we have this opportunity again. We're not going to donate money to any campaign, but we want to use our megaphone, not necessarily for particular candidates, but to raise this issue. Because if we don't raise the issue, who will? And we're talking about who do we align with across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to really raise the issue. Once again, check out our website. We have videos, links to our past events, and you can become aware of what we're doing with our candidates and our work. Volunteer with us, get involved and support our strategic initiatives, and attend future briefings. The next one that will be announced officially soon is February 25th. We want to talk about what the legislative policies are that both the House and the Senate are working on in 2021. I know that we're not the majority. I know that the Democratic-led initiatives won't get much discussion. I know that Governor Wolf's policy discussions and setting the stage won't get a lot of discussion in the legislature. And that's where we come in and other progressive organizations come in. That's where the media comes in. We have to amplify the message. Katie Muth, who's the a senator who we supported in her election in 2018, will be speaking about what she's working on as head of the policy committee for the Democratic caucus for the Senate. And we'll have somebody talking about what's going on in the House. And more importantly, we're going to talk about, again, what you can do to help us amplify these messages. Because if we don't talk about it, it's not going to get out there. And by we, I mean the whole infrastructure around electing progressive people in Pennsylvania. And in March, we've got a couple of speakers lined up, and we're going to talk about what's going on in the state government committee having to do with election laws and how they've been, all the discussion about taking away mail-in ballots and taking away some of the advances that were put out at the end of 2019. We will send out the media guide. Oh, somebody had asked a question about judges and other local races. You know, Represent does not support any, financially, we don't support anything other than state legislature races, both the House and the Senate, progressive women running for these offices. But what we want to do is, we're talking about having an event in later this year, where we would talk about what are these judge races, what happens at the different judicial levels, and what we don't know about these races. So we're going to have a speaker come on and talk about what are the different races. And at that point, we'll advertise fairly wide that any women who are running for in judicial races we'd be happy to have you come on and identify yourself and talk about your position. But first of all, we hear about these things. What does a Commonwealth Court judge do? So those are the kind of things that we want to continue our education for all of you. And that's it. Support Represent PA. We want to bring more content to you. We want to be able to talk about more of these issues. And we want you to understand what's going on in Pennsylvania in 2021 in order to advance our agenda for 2022. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you again to Bridget and UltraViolet for being with us. I think it's been, oh, somebody also put in there about words that win in the race class narrative. We're talking about having a breakfast briefing on what is that? And what are the kinds of words people should be using to make sure that we have winning campaigns? So that's also on our list of things to bring to you in general. Sorry. So thank you very much. Take care.